Hello, I'm going to read chapter 8 called Bad Vibe from our Bearwalker book. I lean my head back against the rough bark that still clings to the logs sliding on the wall of the boys' cabin. I've been assigned a fire tending detail, but I've slipped away from it. It's only an hour until dark, and it's the kind of darkness that comes early, more suddenly, more completely here in the forest. There's no gradual fading into twilight like there is in the Lake Plain lands. Just 1 second it's day, and the next second it's deep night. I should be bringing more wood to make sure there's enough for the fire to keep burning all night. There's electricity in the cabins, but when 9 o'clock comes, it's supposed to be lights out, total darkness inside. And aside from the lights that are kept on in the two building latrines and in front of the main building, lights that I know will look pitifully small, the only illumination outside will be from the campfire. There's a full moon tonight, but it's been increasingly cloudy this afternoon. So even those ancient beings of light that show their faces through the blanket of night probably won't be looking down on us. But I'm not getting wood. For one reason, the person who's in charge of the fire scares me even more than I've actually heard what he had to say. Oh, now that I've actually heard what he had to say, hair stands up on the back of my neck when I remember the sound of his voice. It spooked me even more when I looked around and saw that his voice was clearly not having that effect on everyone else. To them, it sounded the way he wanted it to sound: deep, reassuring, helpful, informative. "Pay attention now, young people," he rumbled. "Watch how I'm holding this knife while I make this fire stick. There's a right way and a wrong way. Right way, cut away. Wrong way, taking it back. You never want to cut toward yourself unless you are fixing to slice the skin off your finger for a little snack." Ha ha. And everyone laughed with him at the joke about cutting his own flesh. Well, almost everyone. They even laughed when he pretended to just do that, slice a piece of flesh off his finger. I was waiting now to try to talk with the one person who looked skeptical as Walker Whitebear gave his little demonstration about fire making. That person was engaged in a serious discussion around the corner from where I was standing. My aim was not to eavesdrop, but sometimes you just can't help hitting what you aren't aiming for. "You might be overreacting, Kirk," Mrs. Smiler says. "You only met the dude 2 hours ago." "Listen, Jenny," Mr. Wilbur says. I can picture him stroking his chin with his fingers as he says it. "There's something wrong here." "A bad vibe?" Mrs. Smiler replies. I can tell by her tone she's being sarcastic. When she's teasing someone, she likes to resort to 60s lingo, even though she grew up in the 90s. She'll say things like, "You're tripping me out, man," when a kid complains that PE class is too hard, or "right on" when someone manages to do something like a forward roll correctly. "This isn't a joke," Mr. Wilbur says. I'm not used to hearing him sound so serious. And yes, I'm getting a bad vibe about this whole trip. Why would they hire someone like him? After the first 5 minutes of his lecture, you could see he didn't know squat about fire making. And it's not just him. I didn't know the entire staff of the camp had changed. The only people who were here before are the cook and the caretaker. "So you don't like Mr. Mack either?" "Now that you mention it, no, I don't like this. I'd like to see his resume. Does he talk or act like someone who's used to working with adolescents? And did you see the way he treats the Osgoods? They've been here for over 20 years, and he acts like they're just peons. And what was up with him just reading from a magazine and pretending it was a lecture about bears? And all that talk about that kind of injuries bears can inflict on a person? It was like he was trying to either bore them or frighten them to death. There's something fishy going on." "Then why haven't there been any complaints from other school groups coming here?" Mrs. Smiler asked. She's not joking now. Mr. Wilbur's words seem to be getting through to her. "Listen," Mr. Wilbur says, "we're the first group to come through this fall. Don't you remember? Camp Chuckamuck was closed for the last 2 months of the summer. But did you know that it wasn't even certain it would ever open again?" Of course, I'd been listening now. By now, I pay more attention as Mr. Wilbur explains how Mr. and Mrs. Philo, whose family founded the camp 2 generations ago, just decided this past year they were too old to run it any longer. He'd had a heart attack and she had bad arthritis. They'd immediately been offered a huge amount of money for their 1,500 acres by developers. People were interested in buying luxury condos in the wilderness, and because the camp was not inside the boundaries of the Adirondack Park, development was not restricted by the Adirondack Park Agency. Chuckamuck was less than an hour's drive from the Adirondack Northway, a four-lane highway that led from Montreal in one direction and New York City in the other. Chuckamuck was also less than a half an hour from some of the prime skiing areas in New York. The state of New York had also been trying to obtain the land to add it to the forest preserve. It was only a short time ago that the decision had been made not to sell, at least for now. The Philos were less interested in the money than in preserving their beloved camp for the young people. They had no living children of their own. Their own children had died in an accident. Their only heirs were two nephews, so the plan now was to not sell it to either the state or the developers. Instead, they were putting the whole camp into a conservation easement to make it possible for more generations of kids to come here. That was what Mr. Wilbur explained, and that he knew all of his background information because the Philos, the people who own the camp, are longtime friends of his own parents. Mrs. Smiler had been listening without making a peep, though through that whole long explanation. But from the sound of her voice, when she finally does speak up, she seems unimpressed. So it's a win-win situation for the kids and the founders of the camp. Groovy. What's the hassle? I hear Mr. Wilbur sigh, then take a deep breath. Listen, he says. The papers haven't been signed yet. What if this whole camping season is a disaster? What if they decide not to put it into an easement and it ends up being sold to developers? You know who would benefit financially? Those nephews. And I'd be willing to bet they're the ones who hired this rinky-dinky staff. Kirk, Mrs. Smiler replies. I still think you're being paranoid. Get real. I wait until the sound of her feet walking away on the gravel is gone. And then I go around the corner to where Mr. Wilbur is still standing. Baron, he says, dropping his hand from his chin and trying to lose the worried look on his face. What's up? More than you know, I think. More than you know.